team about that makes that more of a like, now we're working together and we're having this conversation. And I just think the problem with film is because the designer conversations can be very separate. So the director's having a conversation with the production designer, and then they're having a conversation with the costume designer, and they're still all talking about the story that's being told, but there's no one moment of like, let's all get together and talk about this, and let's all get together and get on the same page from the very beginning of what the story is. Because as soon as you start going out in satellite conversations, you're going to talk about the characters and their worlds in a slightly different way with each department, and pieces will get missed. And then it's really up to the other departments to then also make sure that they're connecting with one another. So if you're not getting the conversations to know what your other departments are doing as a designer, you should be going in and making those conversations happen on your own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
like
great.
Don't wait for production.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
wondering, so first of all, I'm wondering if any of you guys are like more like directors, designers, writers, if you're interested in self-producing, or if you have a project that you're already like in production for, or like in pre-production for. What would you say, because there's so many different levels of filmmaking, right? Like when you're an indie filmmaker, having this conversation with your designers is very different because of budget and time and all of this. And also, you don't really get to have an assistant most of the time. You're like your own department, right? As opposed to bigger projects or like union projects. So what would you say is very different from when you're working in indie filmmaking? What is the difference in terms of how is the collaboration going to be different because of those restrictions, and what are the things that you should bear in mind, is specifically when you're hiring designers, when you're having your first like pre-production meetings or even the interview? What are some elements that you have to keep in mind when you're working with like an ultra budget?
Yeah.
And that can be as simple as like practically, like you have to think that you cannot do a million takes, so your costume should be, or like something that is a little bit more like artistic or like metaphysical, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So if you're working on a really small, like I just actually did a micro budget feature film because I really love the script and it's period film, and it was like all the things that I want to do work wise, except that they didn't have the financial backing. And so in that case, it becomes, there's a level of expectations that have to be managed when you are looking at doing a film that's super low budget. And, you're going to be a lot more hard pressed to get that perfect, if you're doing a period film and it's getting it perfect period is going to be less possible the smaller the budget. So understanding that, then being flexible in how you maybe approach the world you're creating. Like maybe you intentionally then say, you know what, we can't do it perfect 70s, or we can't do it perfect 50s. We don't have the budget. So what rules do we want to abide by from that era and that world to then be able to like evoke that in our story without causing us to be super constrained monetarily, because now all of a sudden we can only buy one jacket and that jacket has to be the jacket because that's going to eat up 50% of our costume budget for that one outfit. So like that's one way of thinking about when you're working on an indie budget, and like how to like, it's really about managing expectations. I also think there's a big mistake in thinking, or flaw in the thinking out there, that I know that we never really know, like funding and things being greenlit is such a weird up in the air situation. It's kind of like all the shoes have to drop at the same moment in the exact position that they need to be in order for projects to be greenlit. So most designers understand that. Most designers know that. Regardless of that, if you know that you're going to be doing a film or you're working to greenlight a project, getting and that you're getting closer to being able to greenlight it, getting your designers on board earlier will allow them to think about the project earlier. And even if they're not working on the job, in like they won't be available for you to like answer every single question and email you have, but they might be able to say, hey, I've got a couple hours on Saturday, why don't we talk about the script?
Mhm.
And then that'll allow them to go out into the world, live their life, do the rest of their jobs, and be like, oh, this reminds me of the thing we talked about on our meeting this weekend. I'm going to make a mental note that this store has it. Or maybe they're like, you know what, I'm going to buy it for my kit since I might actually be able to use it in this film. And
Mhm.
now something that I wouldn't have looked at and I wouldn't have paid attention to, I'm now going to pay attention to, and I'm going to make note of, and also allow it to influence the way that I see the world of the story, right? So maybe also it allows your designer to read a book that they wouldn't have read if they didn't have your project in mind.
Mhm.
And that if you wait and hire them for like go time, because pre-production, if you're not doing design meetings and you're hiring a designer a week to 2 weeks before filmmaking, that's too late in the thought
Yeah.
process, in terms of like telling deep stories with deeply meaningful imagery. And, you know, that is we had talked about this before the webinar. Filmmaking is a visual art based in literature, and the literature is our script. But people listen to how you say it over what you say. And in film, that is your visual, like the world you create visually and with sound. And the what you say is your script. So we want people to really hear the what we're saying, which means we really need to think about the how we say it. What do we put in front of the camera? Why is it there? Why does it matter? And like there's always happy accidents, and things can become something more than you anticipated,
Mhm.
and that's great, like those happy like discovery moments. But you really have to think about that in advance. And if you're hiring your designers right when you're needing them to actually start going out and physically buying things and getting ready for fittings and doing the alterations and like planning all of the actual timeline stuff that like has to be done in order to get it in front of the camera and be ready for filming, then you're really hiring them a little too late. And then especially on indie projects where they're not going to have the resources to buy, you know because there's a couple resources when on indie films that you don't have the manpower and you don't have the budget, right? So on a big TV show, I can say, we don't know what this character is going to be. We just got last minute casting yesterday or today, and they play tomorrow. So I'm going to go out, and we kind of did a board, but I'm going to go out and buy literally 10 different pants, 10 different suits, like jackets, like 10 of everything. And we're going to have a rack or two of clothing to play with in the fitting room to then be able to figure out who this character is really last minute. That's a lot of clothing. And then if you think about, then all of that has to get returned. You need the manpower to be able to return all that. You don't have that luxury in an indie film. In an indie film, your designer, especially if they're a solo, um like on this last film, I was the department. So I
Mhm.
was the costume designer, the tailor, the wardrobe supervisor, the set costumer. And it's always fun to get to go back and do that. I don't think anybody's ever too big for any of the roles as you get higher up. You just keep honing your skills. But that you go in and you know, if you're doing all those jobs, I don't have time to go back out shopping again. So if I don't have casting, I'm going to buy everything I need in advance because I might not be able to leave set. Like on this job, we were on location in the middle of nowhere. So I didn't have the same resources that I have at my fingertips as if I was in the city. So I had to plan for that, which meant I had to buy a lot more than I would have because we were waiting on some casting.
Mhm. That
Makes
makes sense.
sense.
I'm wondering because you're mentioning, you're saying how important it is to be working with your directors sorry, your designers like early on,
Mm-hmm.
specifically when you're a producer, or director, or writer. But it's
Mm-hmm.
for somebody who might be doing their first short film or maybe their first feature film.
Yeah.
It doesn't have this go-to person. How can directors and writers meet designers if they haven't if
Mm-hmm.
specifically if they're working in the commercial world and they might not want to ask somebody that they worked on set, with the normal wage and everything to like transfer into their kind of passion project. So how can you build a relationship early on, and what would you say would I mean, obviously you might agree to your project if you're passionate about the story, but for those of us who are directors and writers, how do you approach and how do you start building a long-term collaboration with designers, specifically in
Mm-hmm.
those early on like meetings or maybe the interviews, like reaching
Mm-hmm.
out? What are the key points that they have to keep in mind to
Yeah.
start working
Okay.
with designers?
So just specifically in establishing new relationships with designers when you don't know them. I think the
Mhm,
best thing to do is if you're on set, you could just say to some like go up to the costume designer that's the head of the department if it's a union job and say, "Hey, you know, I'm doing this project. I don't know how to meet anybody. Do you know anybody that is starting out that would be interested in this project? Or like, do you know who I could talk to? Because, for
mhm,
example, I know a ton of young designers that
mhm,
would die for an opportunity to get to design something. And so, and I have a big network that I'm a part of that I'd be able to tap into. So, by just posing the question to the department head, you can say like, "Look, I know that this is probably not your thing, and I'm assuming you're too busy, and I wouldn't want to ask you to do this project for me because it's so little. Would you but this is what I'm doing. Do you know anyone who'd be interested?"
mhm,
Now that said, there's a director of photography here in New York that does Succession and some of the big shows, and he's said yes to a lot of my friends'
mhm,
personal projects, and like to be like, you know what, I'm gonna take this bet on you because you need the opportunity, and I can give you something great, and you pay my crew, and that takes care of my crew, and I get paid well, so I don't need the money. I'm happy to support you. I like creating, and so you just also don't know who will say yes and what that could do for you. So I would also say, like, don't be shy about asking. Like,
yeah,
really just ask for what you need. And you can preface it in, I'm assuming this isn't of your interest. You know,
mhm,
I just wanted, I'm looking, but do you know anybody?
mhm,
I think the other way to get people involved is to really think about when you're doing an indie film and you don't know designers, or you also don't think you can bring people on right away, going through and doing a lookbook of what you're inspired by and like what you think the characters who you think these characters might be with their costumes, what you think the world might look like, and really thinking about all the visual elements that would go into your world long before you even hire the designers, if you don't think you can bring them on sooner, will allow you to come to the conversation with a deeper understanding of what you need, so people can jump in and just start right away versus starting with the what's this world that you want. When you work with designers, they're visual people, so we read imagery, we can ask questions about that imagery and say, why did you like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of this image, why did you choose this image, what are you responding to, and then kind of go from there.
mhm. Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
I think that's how you can kind of also buy people into your, like, if you're talking about interviewing people for jobs, right? What questions to ask? Well, if you have a lookbook of like, this is the visual world and aesthetic I'm going for, oftentimes in commercials, you have to do that to pitch it to the client anyways, to get the client. So when you do that for your film, you're also then saying you can gauge this designer that's across the table from you or that you're talking with and be like, oh, they're really lighting up about this idea. They get this idea. They can talk to me about this idea. They ask great questions about this idea. And so then that can also be a way to then understand if the person that you're interviewing is the right fit for that project or the right collaborator for you. So
Absolutely.
I think those are ways to kind of both to hack the system of how to get more out of the designers that you want to work with, and how to find out whether they're a good fit for you as well. I think.
Yeah. What is can you tell us about, like, I guess a collaboration, a very fruitful collaboration, long-term collaboration that you have with someone, be it a director, maybe a producer or a writer, and then what makes this person special and why do you want to keep working with them? Like, how did you manage
Yeah.
to build this long-term fruitful relationship?
Well, it's funny. I actually feel like, oh, there's so many relationships. I think showing up, I'm thinking, let's see. So a lot of my favorite collaborations tend to also be designers that I collaborate with, that I just really enjoy working with, because we work together really well to build this world. So there's that side of it. And so I'm like, that's what kind of like first came up to me, like all those people. But then also, because as designers, we tend to jump around from project to project a lot more than producers
Mhm.
and directors. So there's, I tend to, oftentimes we'll have other designers bring me in and be like, you want to hire Sarah because X, Y, and Z. And like, we work really well together and we already have a language. But then when it comes to directors and stuff, like I also have that. But, then there's the whole level of, like, I have a director friend who has been, I met because I said yes to helping. I found out that he was doing this short. This actress came into a TV show of mine. I'm doing her fitting. We're talking. And all of a sudden she's like, oh, yeah, I'm doing a short with this actor from that show we're talking about. And I was like, oh, how fun. And she's like, yeah, it's this like 40s film noir kind of thing. And I was like, oh, cool. Well, do you guys have a costume designer? Just
Mhm.
like, no. And then I said, well, I'd be happy to help. Check in with the director, see if they want my help. Like, I'll come do that for free. I have stuff. Like, we'll make it happen. And we did, and it looked great. And it was like they weren't anticipating having a costume designer, and I just said, yeah, sure, no problem. I'll come help you out. That's fun. And so he and I have been friends, and like I check in with him and see how he's doing, and our support, and super supportive of him, and I want him to be super successful. He did a show where, there becomes a level also of like, as young directors are climbing the ladder, they're being hired with their agent. They're not necessarily always going to be able to bring the designers on with them. And I
Mhm.
think it's also really important as designers to know that that's the case, and it's nothing personal, and it has nothing to do with who you are and your skill set. Oftentimes, if there's a young director, then producers want experienced designers to be able to work with them because of the risk factor, right?
Mhm.
So it helps take down some of the risk factor versus everybody learning this all at once and then having to spend that money, that could cost extra money. So I think knowing that as a young designer, you just can't get offended if you don't get hired. Like,
Absolutely.
it's just not, it's an
And
unproductive feeling.
Yeah, and there's a match for everyone and for every project, like it's also like you were saying, it's a chemistry feel, right? So
Hmm.
people might just trust you from the get-go, or they might be more like,
Yeah.
skeptical or anything like that, and it's okay.
Hmm.
Um, on the other hand, can you talk about a collaboration with someone else that was less than ideal? And I'm specifically thinking like when you're navigating like early on in your career and you're like building your boundaries and you're
Hmm.
specifically
Yeah.
on a film set when you're told like you should say yes, and then you end up like working for 18 hours, and it's not like this. We've all done these indie projects that are like less than ideal, but you might
Yeah.
get some relationships out of it, right? So you still want to be your
Hmm.
yes and person, but how do you navigate like with those less than ideal collaborations? Obviously you want to step away from them, but like what are some of the boundaries and lessons that you learn, like some things that you realize were like productive and some other things that
Hmm.
you carried on, I guess, for a bit until you let go of them.
Yeah. Well, okay. There's a few things in there. First off, regardless of your position on set, whether you're the director, the producer, the DP, costume designer, production designer, prop master, I don't care. Doesn't matter. You're there to serve the story.
Mhm.
So I think the number one thing is to kind of look at this all and say, I'm here to tell this story. I'm here to help this story. So whatever personal opinions that I have about things, I don't need to, those have to stay out of the conversation, right? Like
Mhm.
it doesn't serve the story and it doesn't serve the work we do. It's if you know, if we get upset about stuff and take things personally, there there are certain behaviors that I'm like, no, that is unacceptable. You're not allowed to yell at people. I don't care what position you're in. Treat everybody with respect. We're all human beings. We all have feelings. That is like, you can feel however you feel about the work. It sucks when you're doing your best and you're misunderstanding the people's needs and wants, and you're trying to navigate that, and like, and then on top of it they're getting and they're frustrated because they want something that you're not delivering. That sucks regardless of the position you're in. Getting up, but people being jerks about it is just never acceptable. And I think that a big part of, it's funny, I do a lot of work on understanding human dynamics and how people relate to one another, and I think it's very important that as collaborators we do that work on our own. So I read, books I would recommend are like Captivate: The Science of Succeeding with People by Vanessa Van Edwards, because she talks about why people, you have to look at why someone's getting upset. Do they feel like they're not being heard? So you need to make sure they understand that you're hearing them. And if you're not, do they feel like they're being disrespected and that's a trigger for them? And coming at it from like, let's see what the points are and how do we navigate those so that I can diffuse the situation. I mean, I would say like I very rarely, even at the beginning of my career, I'm very rarely do I ever feel like I'm being, there's only been a few times where I felt like I was being taken advantage of. And it was more when like, I'm telling you, I'm giving you all I can give you, and you're telling me that that's not enough. Or
Mhm.
I'm saying to you, you're paying me $400 for a week. I have to take this I need another job, and I have to or I have to work another job because this isn't paying me a living. So I can only give you X amount of hours. That's the situation we're currently in. And people get upset about that. Like, those are the moments that I'm like, well, but I think learning how to negotiate is really important for those reasons, because every interaction is a negotiation in a collaboration. And you're
Mhm.
negotiating a lot of things. You're negotiating what's in front of the camera, you're negotiating the relationship that you have with the people that you're working with. And I think if you can come to anything with, how do I best serve this person and their needs? There will always be people who want more out of you than you want to give, should give, whatever you want to think. I think the best way to deal with those situations are to say, take out all the emotion, right? So remove the, how could you do this to me? I can't believe you're doing this to me. Any of those thoughts, or like, you're such a this, that, or the other thing. Like anything that starts with those statements, take those out of the conversation in your own mind. Take them out of the conversation between you and the other person and start with, what are the facts? What is the fact of this moment? The fact is, this person wants me to give them, an 18-hour day every day this week, and they're paying me $400. And
Mhm.
they assumed, right? There was an assumption when they hired me that that's what I would do, but we
Mhm.
didn't discuss this. So really, this is, you have this assumption, I have this assumption, and those two things don't meet and connect. So how do we get to a place where they meet and connect? And that's also like, as a costume designer, I'm also navigating the director's wants of the character, maybe what the producers are wanting, because maybe there's a relationship dynamic there. And then you have the cast and what the cast is going to wear, and their own body image issues and their persona needs, right? There are actors who don't want their face getting messed up with makeup, like with cuts and scars, because they don't want to look unattractive. And that goes the same for their clothing. Then they want to be attractive. So then there's navigating that and what their body image issues are, and maybe they see the character differently and they don't want to wear the clothes you and the director think they should wear. So how do you navigate that? And knowing that just because they don't like my idea, and I don't like their idea, there's always another idea out there, and it's just a matter of finding it and finding the idea that all of you like. And that goes the same with if someone's asking you to work 18 hours and you're like, I didn't sign up for that. This was my understanding when I
Mhm.
took this job.
Yeah.
And so it's the same kind of conversation, just using different information points.
Yeah, and something that might seem obvious, but that is a good remedy to that is to, no matter like how small or big the project is, you always want to have deal memos. So you
Hmm.
don't end up like working 18 hours. And obviously you want to trust people, but you also want to have boundaries, legal boundaries with them,
Yeah,
and having
totally.
a contract is something neutral that you can refer to so no one gets
Yeah.
takes things like personally.
Yeah.
I'm interested in because I know you have a podcast where you
Yeah.
interview other designers, so not just
Hmm.
costume designers, but all kinds of
Hmm.
designers.
Hmm. Hmm.
What are some of the for other departments, for those of us who are directors that are going to be working, like building your world with all these different departments, right? It's a lot of work, and for those of us who are designers and are also collaborating,
Right.
building the world, sorry, with other designers. What are some of the key lessons that you've heard from other people, from other perspectives?
Hmm.
From other designers
Yeah.
in makeup or in our department, like all kinds of other departments.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things with that. Okay. This was so. Oh, I will say really quickly on the like when it comes to collaborating, right, with anybody, like even on this last film that I did where I was the entire department, I still navigated and negotiated and would be like, okay, I can't be on set with you guys today because
Mhm,
I'm building a costume from scratch now based on this actress's needs. So I won't be there. Or I just pulled an all nighter and I need to sleep. So I'm going to take a 4 hour nap today.
mhm,
And that's part of those navigating and negotiating in the every moments of like, I just pulled, I'm doing this literally on salary. Like I'm putting in way more time than is
mhm.
anticipated. So you then have those negotiations. And I think that that goes into then also collaborating with the rest of your team and understanding what they need. So, you know, there's always the issue of who's on set and then who's out shopping or getting ready for the next scene or the next day and what's that workflow like. And so that ends up being the biggest bone of contention between, especially on indie films and indie projects and small projects, that's like cross department. So production designers of like, once you start rolling on a set, the production design's done unless something needs to be moved. So you want somebody who's an onset that can like be an onset art direct, like set decorator to move things around as needed, or an onset, unlike a super indie low budget project where you're bare minimum, bare bones. You then have you would then maybe have the same that might be the same person that's doing the props, or you have to sacrifice that because if you have another location, in order for you to keep the flow going on set and like once you move the camera over to the new location and get it set up and ready and the lights set up, the production designer needs to be able to go there and do that in advance. So
Yeah,
once you start filming on a location, your production designer is going to leave and have to go set up the next location. And so you understanding that workflow, right? And same with props. Prop master has to buy all the props, and then you have your on-set props person who's tracking all of that and making sure that it's available and that everything that's discussed, because there's a prep level, there's prep to every department with design that comes in different times, and it means that the department heads may not be able to be on set with you because they have to get something else ready. And so understanding that process
mhm,
and understanding when you'll have access to your designers, I think is also a big part of that collaboration.
yeah,
And you'll always be ending up asking questions of like, okay, the prop master will come in and say, I here's all the stuff that I read in the script, and like, do we need anything else? So let's just like talk through like just the actual basically shopping list, right? of what I need for this script, for this scene or this day. And then, the production designers is going to ask questions like, well, what kind of shots do you want in this location? And, how are we navigating workflow and movement, right? So they're going to ask you questions on like, what's the actual flow of the space and how do you want the characters to move through the space? So they're going to be asking questions like that. Whereas, if there's a fight sequence, I worked with this makeup artist and I thought it was amazing. She came in because we had a fight sequence and she was like, I have this document I created and it's literally like levels of levels, I would call them like levels of gore or like levels of pain and like what you see. So like, here's a broken nose that's like really broken versus just barely like a scratch. Like, what are we
Mhm.
talking about on the level of how far we're going down the, you know, scars, cuts, wounds, rabbit hole? Like, where are we going with this and how far do you want to go down it? And so it becomes the questions of that, or like, okay, I'm the makeup artist and they're in a fight sequence and they're going to get decked across the face. Well, what side? When am I putting that into, so then that becomes a conversation with the stunt, the stunt coordinator of like, okay, what is the stunts? And what does the director want out of these stunts? And what do we want visually? Like, are we supposed to see that this character just gets completely destroyed and they're like covered in, you know, blood and open cuts, so
Yeah.
you kind of have to start thinking about like, what are the stories you want to tell and how far down these things you want to go. And as a director, your job is more to guide the conversation and kind of keep everybody in the same lane versus always have to be the one with all the answers. And I think that's a big mistake that young directors make of like, I have to have all the answers for all these things. And I may never have actually had to ask these questions that, or even known to ask the questions that this production designer is asking me. I haven't thought about this. And so how do I then navigate that? And I think, you hire designers because they bring something into the table, and sometimes it's not what you want. And then it becomes navigating how to give you what you want, find out if it's something better. Because again, it's not about us. It's not about us as creators. It's not about, what I mean, I think of like Wes Anderson has this aesthetic, yes, but also he works with this one production designer that he's
All
been
the
working
time.
with
It's
on
the same
almost,
thing.
yeah, and like,
Yeah.
and and so how much of the aesthetic is
It's his and then his team.
is
Yeah.
is his, and how much of it's the teams, and how much, where did those, and they've built a language now together of, well, I know, like I worked with a costume designer as an assistant. So even as an assistant, it's the same questions that I would navigate with a director, but of like, what is this person's also their aesthetic?
Mhm.
Because, if they, I worked with a designer who hated like pocket flaps. So
Mhm.
any jacket with a pocket flap, if I did a fitting, I knew that those pocket flaps on that suit jacket had to be tacked down on the
Mhm.
inside, right? I worked with another designer who hated the like cornflower blue. And so didn't matter what it was, you could not buy it. She didn't want it. Don't bring it in the shop. So for whatever reason. And so you kind of start to learn like, oh, or like on another job, I was like, oh, they don't resonate with camo like I thought they would for these characters, these bad guys. So if they're not resonating with camo, okay, then we won't buy camo anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
That
so
makes
it
sense.
becomes,
Yeah.
you're just like learning. Oh,
It's
sorry.
interesting to no, I was saying it's interesting to that you have to have this tunnel vision with your department, like you're saying, like knowing the ins and out of the aesthetic, but also you cannot just have tunnel
Yeah.
vision because it will like blind you from other departments. And actually the aesthetic is like spread throughout. Like that's how you build aesthetic, right? It's like the actual
Yeah.
like cohesion of all the departments. Um we
Yeah. And I think,
we have, sorry, so we have about
yeah.
like 10 minutes left. So I just want to make sure that we have time for questions. Um, okay, so we have two questions. Now, guys, now is the time to write the questions if you have any for Sarah in the chat. The first question from Walter, hi. From the designer's perspective, what has been your most interesting solution to a problem? Do you have any cool stories?
Oh. Well, I think that design is problem solving. So there's always something interesting. I mean, it could be just thinking of the last film I was on. Um, we got a last minute casting due to a lot of factors, especially the whole COVID situation and people trying to figure out what was happening with that. And um, so that meant LA options weren't really available, and we just kind of were trying to navigate stuff. And so, um, but we got this last minute casting, and there's this fight sequence, and this actress. I had budgeted the entire film and talked with the director that everybody has one outfit, and
Mhm.
then that new actress comes in and was like, "Oh, she has this very specific thing she wants. She wanted a costume that that was inspired by the character Emma Peel from the Avengers TV series, British TV series." And I could have easily said, "No, we don't have the budget. We don't have the time. I'm not going to do this." And I would have been supported probably, but there was also a level of, maybe it doesn't matter that I feel that way or not. Like, what is this character and why is this person so into looking like this character? So I went down the rabbit hole of like figuring out who this character is and why she was attached to it and what was the historical significance of this character, Emma Peel. And turns out she's really the first kind of strong, independent female character ever portrayed on television. And she was fun and charming and all these things, and she had this really specific aesthetic, and it was great. And so then I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, like why this character would want that. And I think that I could have very easily been like, no, I'm not doing it, and instead I just said, all right, I'm gonna build this entire thing from scratch for her, because that's what she wants, and the director's like fine with me doing it, so
That makes sense.
we'll
Yeah,
just
it's
use
interesting.
something I have.
Yeah, it's
And
interesting
I don't know
how.
if that answers it.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, let us know what you think, but it's interesting to see that from the actor's perspective as well, that it would like help her
Mhm.
be a better actress and like make stronger choices. That
Mhm.
Walter says it does amazing.
Okay.
um,
Yeah,
Chloe
I think it's
has
just there's
a,
always something.
sorry, Chloe has another question. She's saying, "Hi, ladies. Do you know where how?" This is a very subjective question, I guess, but do you know where how to find opportunities to work on shorts, commercials, or smaller non-union
Mhm.
jobs? So, I guess Chloe, you're interested in like becoming a designer or something like that. Let us know. So we
Yeah.
can see better.
Chloe, tell me what you're looking for. I'll say, so a very underutilized resource that I found is IMDb Pro. Uh, IMDb Pro, it's like I think $200 a year. When you can start reaching out to, like, there are people's contact information sometimes, so you can kind of start looking at people and reaching out that way. But also there's places like Mandy.com, which I think is now just Film and TV Pro. There are going to networking events, meeting people, as many people as you can. You just don't know who's gonna have an opportunity, offering to help people. Well, like I said, like if Chloe, if you want to break into the industry, whether in whatever it is that you want to do, getting on set, getting around people that are doing what you want to do is essential. So even if it's, I want to be in the costume department, but I don't know anybody there, but I'm able to be a production PA for the show, great, do that. Because guess what? You're going to meet all those people, and you can say to the costume team, yeah, I want to do that. Or like, how do I get involved with this? And so you can start opening up the conversation. I think the best thing to also think about when asking for advice on set or like when working is to kind of be able to really pay attention to the room. When a designer's sitting in the car and you're going from place to place, let's say, I might be reading my emails or trying to catch up on something and figure it out, or having a conversation with my team about, if I'm the department head, talking to the assistant about what we need to accomplish, or as the assistant having the reverse conversation, or, so that might not be the moment to ask the questions that you want to ask, but you can say to them, hey, I'm curious about this. Would you let me know when there's a good time to talk?
Mhm.
Because I have these questions. And most people want to help, and the interesting thing is most people don't ask for advice. Some people will give you the cold shoulder, and that's that person, and that has to do with that person and the way that they hold their opportunities in the industry. I just had a girl that I didn't even know reach out to me to ask for advice, and I said, well, why don't we just hop on a Zoom call, because I'd rather just have the conversation than email back and forth, so I can answer all your questions all at once. And
Mhm.
so, you know, turns out she found out about me on Hulu, because I just found out I'm on Hulu. And so I, I just assumed that she was a part of a network and was like, whatever, I'll answer her questions. What's the harm in that? Other people might not feel that way. Other people might feel like, well, if I tell you this, I'm telling you an industry secret, and I
Mhm.
can't do that. Like, that's a job threat. I just don't hold it that way. So if somebody does give you resistance to giving you advice, understand that has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with it has more to do with their own concerns and their own perspective on things. So
Absolutely.
I think that that's the biggest thing if you kind of going
Yeah.
forward.
And it's a good test to see who you're going to be working with. Like because I'm a production designer as well, right? When I started, I would ask
Hmm.
other production designers whose work, like I would watch a lot of short films, web series, things like that, like indie projects, and just email them, cold email, and say, do you need an assistant? I can
Yeah.
come day play for 1 day or for 2 days. And you can do the same thing with directors. You can find directors
Hmm.
groups and or like collectives
Hmm.
and things like that and say, I'm an up and coming designer. I would love to work on your
Hmm.
passion projects. Like just introduce yourselves, like whether you're going through the
Yeah.
hierarchy of becoming someone's assistant and then someone's, like going up art director and everything, like,
Hmm.
or like through directors, through writers, like writing groups saying like you have a screenplay, would love to like consult on your screenplay, would love
Yeah.
to get that conversation so you can start working those muscles.
Hmm.
And if, like you were saying, Sarah, if you're a go-getter and if you're reliable and you have integrity and passion and everything, people are going to come back to you automatically, because that's the way it's
Yeah.
like it works in the industry.
Yeah.
People want to work with good people, reliable people,
Yeah.
and not everyone is reliable. So,
True.
any other
Showing.
questions? I see we have some in the Q&A. Oh, Chloe saying, I'm a full-time wardrobe stylist. I PA and assist shoppers as a day player on TV and film shows, but I'm looking for smaller opportunities to have more responsibilities, smaller projects, since I'm not in the union yet. So, yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Just start reaching out. I think that there's also the like, oh, I just blanked on my thought. Sorry. Talking about what you were saying about like helping people with their projects and stuff, it always goes back to like, you could also, I'm also trying to really, like, I have a ton of friends who are writers and directors, and there's a couple things. Like, sometimes they don't know that they can come and talk to me because they're like, oh, Sarah works at network television, she's not available. And it's like, no, 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 I will by far prefer to take your low budget film over a assist and department head it than be on a major show um if it's a project that I want to do, because I want to build my career as the designer and the department head. So I think, as other people, like, don't be afraid to ask. And then also, when it comes to their projects, I'll say like, hey, well, why don't you send me your script? I can break down the budget for you and tell you what you're realistically going to need on this period film. Or why don't we get on some phone calls and I'll do some renderings for you so you can use that to get funding, right? Because people want to know, we are a part of the product that people are going to receive when they see the film, whether we're designers, whatever part of the job we are doing. And investors want to know where the money's going and why it matters that it's going there. So when you can come in and say, this is the design for the world, and because of this design, we need extra money, and this is why we think that's important, because cosplay is a really big thing, because production value tends to be lower on a lot of these festivals. So we think we can get higher placement in festivals because the production value will be higher, whatever it is that you can kind of use as your justification. And so there will be designers that'll be willing to do that. And it's a fun exercise as well. Like I like to do, I'm excited I'm doing these renderings for my friend's project because I want to practice that skill set. So that's a perfect example of like,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
That's great. That's great. I think that's really, there's so many ways of doing that like you
Yeah.
have to see your skill set as well. If you're really interested in like breakdowns and budget and you're good at that, you should like use
Yeah.
that. Um,
I think
um
also just really
so,
quickly, like
go
to
ahead.
answer Chloe's question too, even if Chloe, even if you don't get to be the one designing on set, maybe you have someone's project that's a passion project that hasn't been done yet, but you can put together boards, right? Now you have something to show people when you go in to interview for another job and be like, I'm working on these are the boards for this film that I'm working with. We're waiting for it to get green light, but this is the work I've done. This is why I've done that work. And then if you don't have a design background, you didn't go to you didn't train in it, read books on costume design, read books on production design, teach yourself and be, same with like cinematography, whatever it is that you want to do, be responsible for your own education and your own understanding of what goes into your job and have that ownership over it. I think
Mm-hmm.
that'll also help you get hired.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful, Chloe. Um, we're gonna have to stop, but for those who are interested in or have other questions, we're gonna have other webinars with Sarah. It's like a whole masterclass series, basically. So we have one next week at the same time, and the week after that. This is specifically good for those who are directors and want to learn about exactly what you're mentioning, Sarah, like building the world and also doing budget. So next week is going to be about doing your budget across the board for departments and incorporating budget into your vision when you're writing the script.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically for those who are writing like higher genre films like sci-fi, horror, like things like that demand like whose visual identity is like the forefront of the film. So if you're interested in that, you can join us next week, and the week after that is going to be about like building the world of your project. So that's really interesting. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank
Any last
you.
words that you want to say?
Well, if you guys want to, you can check out, I actually have a webinar that I had done on budgeting that'll break it down a little more in depth. That'll
Mm-hmm.
be the video recordings of that'll be launching this coming weekend. So if you want to go to designingthevoid.com/budgeting, you can kind of sign up for all that stuff and it'll come in your inbox. And then you can come to with more kind of specific questions. So I can answer
Yeah,
those for you on next week's call.
absolutely. Yeah,
So
and we're going to have a lot of other webinars about specifically for DPs, directors. This week, Thursday, we have directing your first feature film. For those who are directors, writers, producers, you can follow us at SetPatrol on Insta at SetPatrol_EU, on Facebook SetPatrol, and our website is going to be launching on Friday. So for those who are European filmmakers, you can join the beta version. Thanks, guys. I hope that was
thanks.
helpful.
Thank, thank
Thanks,
you for having
everyone.
me. This was really
Yeah, it was
fun.
my pleasure. It was a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
And also, if anyone has more questions about this, you can message me on Instagram at Sarah Cogan Designs
Mm-hmm.
or my podcast, Designing the Void. So
Yeah,
at Designing the Void. I'll answer questions. I can answer other questions there. Always happy to. Feel free to
absolutely.
reach out whenever.
Yeah. And same, you can write to us as well on Instagram, on Facebook, if you had any other questions, or you're wondering about the resources that Sarah shared, or podcast, the book that you were talking about, like all of this, we can. And if anyone wants a recording as well, we can send it to you. Just send us email. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.